Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or whichever time zone you're currently in. Right, thanks for that. Also, just a bit of a heads up, we've also got Neil Hodgkinson, who I've presented this a number of times with. Now, Neil is going to be basically in the chat window, kind of monitoring the questions for myself. And if you've got any questions, Neil will do his best to try and answer them as we go through, as both Neil and myself actually know the content of this actually reasonably well. So what I'm going to do is just a little bit of another heads up. Based in Auckland in New Zealand, across the other side of the world here. So that's why I've got this rather interesting accent. So there may be a little bit of a time delay and a lag with regards to the actual slides being presented, as well as when I go into the demo environment and start trying to highlight or demo some of the stuff that I'll be doing here. So anyway, as to who I am, so basically I'm a principal consultant based in, working in Microsoft New Zealand. Been with Microsoft coming up for about 14 years now. My background with regards to SharePoint has gone back quite a number of years, right back to the original Tahoe, which was the code name for SharePoint Server 2001. I've done a number of certifications, including getting Microsoft Certified Master on 210, did the Certified Architect certification on 210, went through and recertified again on 2013 as part of the Microsoft Certified Solution Master. And when we used to run those certifications, used to be part of the MCSM SharePoint instructor team. So, did a number of presentations, ran a couple of modules, and also did some work behind the scenes. The other thing that I also do, I'm also part of the Worldwide Centre of Excellence for SharePoint, commonly known as the SharePoint Rangers. So I tend to get involved in quite a number of different projects and engagements around the world, and tend to get stuck in doing some of the more hairy stuff that's involved from a SharePoint perspective. The little pictures there are just a little bit some information about myself. More than happy to go in and discuss those offline as to what they actually mean and what they actually represent. But they probably give you a little bit of an insight into who I am. My contact information is also up there on the screen as well. So it's wayne.ewington@microsoft.com. So more than happy to try and field some questions after this if required. The only thing that I will say is that I do tend to get a lot of emails. So although it may take a while to actually come back and answer your questions, I'll do my best to actually go through there and answer those for you. So basically what this session's all about, what we're going to do as part of this is try and understand the concepts of business continuity management and what are the implications from a SharePoint perspective. We're also going to look at how do we differentiate between high availability and disaster recovery, because often when we come in and start talking about these things, they tend to get a little bit confused, and we don't always, aren't clear about, are we talking about high availability, or are we talking about disaster recovery, or are we talking about both? And really the main focus of this is how can we use SQL Server AlwaysOn to actually implement high availability and disaster recovery for SharePoint and looking at it from that perspective. So that's what we're going to try and do. So in order to do this, we'll go through and do some definitions, just make sure we've got some common vocabulary around how do we actually define business continuity management. We'll then give a quick overview about what is SQL Server AlwaysOn and how does, what that actually makes up. Then we'll dive in and look at SharePoint high availability, then look at how do we do it from a SharePoint disaster recovery. Now we will have a few extra bits and pieces in here around some new stuff that's actually come out. So as part of what I'm going to be showing you will be some bits which aren't currently available, but should be coming out very, very shortly. So there'll be some new bits and pieces that I'll be showing you in here. So let's kick off and start looking at the definitions first. So I'll just give this a few seconds just to make sure that everything does display on screen, because I do know that there can be network latency issues. Okay. So the first thing that comes up is what exactly is business continuity management? So we've got this rather long definition around the statement that comes out and says, what exactly is business continuity management? So really, if we look at it, it's around disciplines and processes that can identify potential impacts which threaten an organization. So the idea being here is, how do we actually get an effective response that safeguards the business so we can actually come back and actually run that? So if you kind of digest that back and look at that, what this business continuity management, it basically really consists of high availability and disaster recovery. So it's bringing it back and looking at how do we actually get our business up and running again, looking at from high availability and this other thing called disaster recovery that we've got there. Now, there is actually an industry standard, which is ISO 22301, which goes through and defines exactly what is business continuity management. So you can actually go through and do a process around this. So if you wanted to go out and go against those ISO standards, you can, and actually look at that and actually follow that detailed guidance around how you actually do that. But if we then dive in and look at high availability, so once again, we've got this really weird, funny description which actually describes, what exactly is high availability. But if we digest that back and look at it, what that really means is that it's about protecting our service level agreements against the agreed fault domains. So that's really what we're trying to do. It's about how do we actually protect these service level agreements, our SLAs, and what do we then actually do to make sure that we protect those against our particular default domains that we've got defined in here. So if we look at that, what exactly is our service level agreements? So a service level agreement is usually just a level of services between the vendors, suppliers, clients, and or inter-organizational departments. So the key thing here is actually looking at and defining what type of availability do we want to have. And the way that we tend to define that is using this classic, number of nines type approach on there. The other thing too, just to be aware of, is that when you come up and start defining your server level agreements, you've also got to make sure that if you take a dependency, or you shouldn't take a dependency on something else that you may not be able to adhere to. For example, if you've got a dependency on like a third-party vendor that's going to be involved as part of your server level agreements, then you've got to ensure that you've actually got a back-to-back service level agreement with that particular organization as well. So it's the old classic story of don't take a dependency you can't actually meet. So if we look at these classic 999s that we've got out there, people tend to want to go out with these very, very high availabilities, getting right through to having 99.9999%. Now if we look at that, what that really means is that the number of downtime per year, per month, per week can actually start to, be quite significantly, not much associated with that. So what this really means is that if we look at this, what we need to be able to do is actually meet these. So if we take, for example, the classic of being 99.9, what this means is that, the amount of downtime we can actually have is 8.76 hours per year, which equates to 43.2 minutes per month, which equates to 10.10 minutes a week. Now, if you kind of think about that, what that means is that that's actually quite hard to actually, adhere to. So if something goes wrong, or if your SharePoint server farm, for example, goes down, can you actually get hold of your support people in time in order to actually, investigate the problem, resolve the problem? And can you do that in 10.10 minutes, such that the farm's actually back up and available if it actually goes down? So what this really means is that you've got to really look at what exactly are your percentage availabilities that you're trying to adhere to, and then actually look at what does this actually mean, and can I actually meet those particular times that I've got associated with that. Now the interesting thing is that we've got is that 99.9 is actually the SLA that Office 365 actually adheres to, or just basically what they actually state as being out there. However, although that's actually been stated, in reality it's probably closer to 99.98%, or basically that's what it's been documented and stated, even though the standard SLA is 99.9. So although you can actually go out and state that you're going to get these, you can actually exceed these expectations around that. But it does really mean that you need to understand exactly what processes you need to be able to put in place in order to actually meet these SLAs that you've gone through and defined there. The next thing that we start to look at, which is important, is around these fault domains. So what the fault domain is really what are you trying to protect against. So if something goes wrong, what am I trying to protect against it? Is it the data center? So, if the data center goes down, have I got another data center available associated with that? Can I fail over to that other data center and have that going? Or is it the actual rack? Is it the server, the host server that's actually hosted within the rack? Is it the actual server that's in there? Is it the power supply that's in there? Is it the network card that I've got associated in there? Or is it the virtual server, or actually going right down from a SharePoint service topology perspective, is it actually the service instance that's actually running within inside those machines? So this actually helps drive exactly what we're trying to protect ourselves against if we look at what is our fault domain that we need to actually protect against in order to meet our SLAs. So just to give an example of that, one of the common scenarios we often talk about is building what we call the Franken rack. So if we go through and start putting together a rack as an example, we can go out, get a standard rack that we've got here, and the first thing we'd probably do is go through and put a power supply into it. We'd then go through, put some network adapters into it, okay, which is pretty standard stuff that we've got in there. And then we go and fill it out, puts a number of different servers in there, put some disk storage, etc. in there, and we're actually pretty good from a standard rack type configuration. However, we've got a dependency here. The issue we've got here is that if we look at this particular rack, we've got a lack of redundant power. So if our power supply goes down, then our rack becomes unavailable. So what do we do about that? So how do we actually address that particular issue? The other thing that we need to think about too is that we've only got one network connectivity. So once again, if that rack, that network connectivity goes down, how do we actually make sure that our rack is actually up and running and still works as we're expecting? So we could start doing some interesting things here. What we could potentially do here is actually put some, put another, network adapter in there and put another power supply in there. So hence, if one of the power supplies goes down, we're still available and we can still use this rack. But then, what happens if this is a really, really critical machine or a real critical rack? What happens if we want to do maintenance and we need to take one of these particular power supplies or network adapters out of here? Then perhaps what we should be doing then is putting in another one, or so we've basically got three. So we're still going to be highly available if we're doing maintenance on this particular rack. So what this starts meaning is that we're starting to get some rack configurations which start to not be standard, and we're starting to do some interesting things with it, putting in based on what our particular requirements are, trying to build out these horrible racks that we actually got associated with this. So the net result of this is that the data center people start to hate you because you're coming out and you're actually putting in these non-standard specifications for racks that are going in there. The other thing that could potentially happen here is that the type of hardware that's actually in there, we could have different versions, etc., of the network adapters, or different versions of or different types of the power supplies, etc., in there. And this, from a data center and from the people that are managing this, becomes quite a horrible thing for them to actually look after and manage. So what this means then is that if we look at this, our particular fault domain is actually the rack. So we could then, as an example, say, right, we're going to look at this rack, and I'm going to treat the rack as my fault domain. And what I can then do is actually have, or basically template this out and say, right, my rack's my fault domain. I'm actually going to have two racks. So if one of the racks goes down, I can then fail over and continue to use the actual other rack, etc., associated with that. So that's all pretty good from a rack perspective. But the other thing we do need to consider, though, is what about what's actually been running inside that particular rack, and what are the actual servers, etc., that are in there. So if we have a look inside these, what we can then do is have a server which is hosting a number of different servers in there. So if you look at it from a SharePoint farm perspective, and we can basically split these across the different racks that we've actually got here. So if we have a look at that, you kind of think, right, we're actually pretty good here because we've got our service instances split across. We've done duplications of those across the different servers that we've got in our SharePoint farm. But the problem we've got here, though, is that if our rack on the left-hand side goes down, we're still not going to be highly available. Now, the reason behind that is that our secure store service instance is actually not been running on the right-hand rack. So what this means is that if our fault domain was actually the rack, we do need to also think about what are the actual servers that are running in there, and well as what are the service instances that are going to be on there to making sure that they're appropriately balanced. And this really comes down to understanding what exactly are we trying to protect ourselves against, and then making sure that we actually architect our solution accordingly to make sure that we're still going to be highly available from that type of perspective. So if we're going to change tack a little bit and start looking at disaster recovery. So once again, we've got this nice long definition about exactly what is disaster recovery. The key thing about there, though, if we kind of look at that long definition that we've got there, what it really means is that we're going back about recovering critical operations that enable the business to function. Now, the way that we usually go through and start defining this and looking at this is that we look at it from two different perspectives, and that's from what we call the recovery point objective, or RPO, and the recovery time objective, the RTO. The easiest way to think about this is that if we've got our disaster that occurs, our RPO is how much acceptable data loss can we actually agree to lose, and I'm talking about committed data here. So the idea being here is that if I save something, for example, into a SharePoint database, how much of that can I actually lose if a disaster actually occurs? The RTO then is how long is it going to take me to actually restore after that particular disaster, and when I come back up and available. And we tend to define the RPO and RTO in times. So if we've got an RPO of, for example, an hour and an RTO of 3 hours, what that means is that we can lose an hour's worth of data and we'll be up and running fully functional with that hour's worth of data that we've committed to within 3 hours again. So really, when you start talking about disaster recovery, these things actually become the key and the critical things that you need to be looking at and starting to try and talk to the business in terms of RPO and RTO. Now, what tends to happen then is that we get into these interesting conversations, which is that the RPO and RTO, when you start talking to the business, they want this to be zero, or as close to zero as they can actually get them. Now, the issue there then is, because you want to get down to an RPO and an RTO as being close to zero, it tends to drive the cost up quite significantly. Because what this means is that you're having to protect yourself against everything you can think of. And you can't have a single point of failure, etc., which tends to put in a lot of redundancy in here, puts in some additional operational costs and processes and procedures, etc., that go with this. So what tends to happen is that the business comes in and says we want an RPO and RTO close to zero. We do the cost analysis and kind of present that back. That goes and gets presented back to the Chief Financial Officer because of the cost amount. And we tend to come back and have a little bit more of a realistic conversation around, how much data can they actually afford to lose, etc. So it's usually just a very, very common thing that happens here. So the other thing too, just kind of bringing up, it kind of relates to our business continuity management. So there's a lot of organizations that like to come up with this concept of actually having what we call a stretch farm configuration. So the idea being here is that we can have a single SharePoint farm which is located across two different data centers. So the servers are located in one data center and some of the other servers are located in a different data center. Now, this kind of acts like a disaster recovery kind of high availability type scenario, which kind of provides both. So although we can kind of do this, one of the critical requirements around this is that it does need to have a less than 1 millisecond network latency. So when SharePoint Server 2013 originally came out, this type of topology was originally not supported. Now, the reason behind this is that although you can go through and do this type of configuration, it can introduce some performance issues and can also it can cause a number of issues associated with the farm, but just the way that the SharePoint actually works behind the scenes with regards to how transactions are actually being committed and used, and queries are actually being run against the databases. So when 2013 originally came out, there was originally not supported, and the statement came back as being associated with saying that it had to be in the same physical data center. Now that kind of caused a number of interesting ramifications out in the industry, and so the support statement was modified a bit back in April 2013 to say that it needed to be back into the same logical data center. So the key thing about this is that you can do these, but we prefer that you don't. And if you do it, then you do need to look at your network latency times and make sure that you're less than 1 millisecond 99.9% of the time for a period over 10 minutes. Now, I know that Neil Hodgkinson, who's currently helping to monitor calls, is actually doing a lot of work on this. So we're trying to get some better guidance around exactly what this actually means if you do go down with a stretch farm topology. However, the guideline is don't do this if you can, but if you do make sure that you adhere to this network latency times that we've got here. So the other thing that kind of comes up, it's kind of related, but this is a little bit of a left field. This becomes more applicable when we get in and start looking at the high availability and disaster recovery side of things. So one thing that we need to think about, particularly from a SharePoint perspective, is around how do we actually isolate our physical dependencies. Particularly from a from a SQL Server perspective. So we've got a couple of things that we can do, which is using SQL aliases and or using DNSA records. Now, it doesn't really matter which way you go, so long as you start actually thinking about these and actually getting these in place, very, very early. Now, there's, some pluses and minuses for going with SQL aliases, and there's some pluses and minuses for going with DNSA records. So as part of some of the work that we've been doing internally within Microsoft, which we call the product line architecture, our guidance here is actually to go with DNSA records. Now, we say A records and not CNAME records. Now, the reason behind that is that if you do CNAME records and you want to do a Kerberos implementation, that can actually cause a number of issues to actually do that Kerberos delegation through there. So basically the guideline is stick with the A records. It would make life a lot easier. The key thing about this, though, is that you do need to start thinking about this as part of your architecture and designs of your farms up front. So do look at the types of database types that you've got, the supportability statements around what type of replication you can do with them, and actually start designing your farms up front with some DNSA records or SQL aliases. You'll see what this means when I get into the demos as to what some of the implications will be. The other thing you can also do too, just to make life a little bit easier, is that if you go into the central admin, you can also go through there and configure the default database server as well in there. So that basically states which server am I going to use for actually creating any new databases, so I don't actually have to go through and modify this using PowerShell or anything like that. Just a little tip you can do there. So what we're going to do now is have a look at always-on availability groups. Now, we've got this interesting diagram, which has actually got a little bit of history behind it. So this is actually something that myself and Neil, when we first were going to put this talk together. So Neil's actually based in the UK. I'm based in New Zealand, and we're trying to work out how we could actually come up with an always-on availability group, type of configuration, how we can actually configure and get our farm up and going. So we kind of drew this up using OneNote, believe it or not, and kind of collaborated and actually started pushing and describing as to how this could potentially work from both an HA and disaster recovery perspective. So what it would do now is just kind of look at this always-on availability groups. So this is new to SQL Server 2012. And the easiest way to describe it is kind of like clustering, and it's kind of like mirroring. It's kind of a hybrid of the two kind of bringing together. Now, unfortunately, some of the vocabulary that we use here tends to be kind of similar and related. But if you kind of look at it, it's kind of, the clustering, it's kind of mirroring behind it. Now, the cool thing about this, though, is that what we can do with it is that we've got a couple of different options we can configure on this. We can do either sync commit or we can do asynchronous commit of our particular, of the databases that we're actually trying to go across in here. The thing about with regards to the sync commit, though, is that we can go up and do two sync replicas. So basically that provides the ability to actually have 3 copies of everything. So this is a little bit unlike mirroring, where we can only have effectively 1 sync replica. So in other words, we've got 2 copies of the data. With AlwaysOn, we can have up to 2 sync replicas, which basically provides us 3 replicas. From an asynchronous commit, we can basically go through and go through quite a number of different asynchronous commits across to other ones. And we can do another thing too, which is have readable secondaries. So this provides the ability that we can actually go through and read the data or the content that we're actually that we're replicating across, and have that available and be able to read elsewhere. The other thing we can do with this too is, from an AlwaysOn availability group's perspective, is that we can also say what's going to be our backup target selection. So what we mean by that is that because we're going to be replicating data across, we can say, right, I want to use this as the primary source of doing our backup. So that could, basically provide the ability that we want to keep where we're actually doing the transactional stuff quite heavily intense, and we can actually then say use this other particular server, so we can actually then do our backups from it. So we can actually, don't worry about don't have to worry too much about the I/O, etc., associated with that. So there's also just a couple of little tips that we need to think about too when we go through and set up AlwaysOn, and one of them is around the quorum. So because we're actually using a cluster, we do need to adhere to some of the clustering types things that we've got in here. The thing here is that we should really have an odd number, because what we want is when we set up the quorum is that we do want them to be able to do a vote, and if we've only got, for example, 2 nodes in our particular cluster, then if one of the nodes go down, then we don't know whether or not we should do an automatic failover, or if we fail one over and bring one up. So generally what that means is that we should actually have an odd number in there. Now the cool thing that we can do with this is that we can do what we call a file share quorum. So we can actually, instead of having to actually pull up like we used to do with SQL Server mirroring and have a witness server, which was another SQL Server instance running there, we can actually point it to a file share that both nodes can see, and that can actually participate in the quorum voting if we needed to. The other thing to consider too as part of setting up this quorum is whether or not it should be voting or have a no vote stance associated with this. So there is some discussions as part of the SQL Server team about, for example, if you're doing an asynchronous replication across, should it participate in the vote or not? And some of the discussions around that is that it probably shouldn't. Now, that can actually have a ramification too from a SharePoint perspective, in that if we are going across different locations, doing an asynchronous commit across, etc., we could potentially end up getting into this stretch farm type configuration, which is something we may not want to do. The other thing too to think about is we've got this database backup location. Now we're going to see how this actually fits in when we get into the demo, but essentially what happens is that there's a common file share that all nodes need to be able to see in order to actually start seeding and getting these AlwaysOn availability groups up and running. Now that needs to be in a common place, and all of the nodes need to be able to see that. So it's just another consideration about where do you actually place that common file share. And the other thing to worry about, of course, is the firewall ports. So if we're using the default ports, we're using 1433, which is the standard SQL port, single standard port that SQL uses, and then 5022, which is a port that AlwaysOn uses. So people that have done mirroring, this is exactly the same port that is used for mirroring, but it's actually basically being reused from an AlwaysOn availability group perspective. So just taking a little bit of another side step and kind of looking at this is just more from a bit of a reference information for everyone. So if we've got recovery time objective going up on the vertical axis, and we've got recovery point objective going on the horizontal, what we can start to do is that when we start looking at our RPO and RTO times, this will kind of give you an idea as what type of database replication that we should be thinking about and how that it could actually fit in there. So obviously if we've got something which is close to 0 or seconds, then we look at doing synchronous, either mirroring or AlwaysOn, or we could potentially go with failover clustering. Now the issue with failover clustering is because it shares the same storage or the same storage, if the storage actually goes down, then you could actually get into a very, very different type of recovery time objective or recovery point objective. So it could actually expand out. So it's just something to be aware of when people start saying, well, failover clustering can actually, give us a 0. It really comes down to what is actually the fault that you protected yourself against on that one. Look at doing mirroring either asynchronously or always on asynchronously. Getting up and doing log shipping, which has been pretty much the other way of doing things, where we can ship things out to our other servers. And then we get back into the backup and restore. So like I said, this is primarily just as a reference for yourselves, just to go back, and when you start having these RPO and RTO conversations, it does kind of drive us to which way or which type of technology you need to use from a database perspective. So what we're going to do now is have a look at high availability and how does that actually relate from a SharePoint perspective. The key thing about doing it from a high availability perspective is that this provides the shortest possible RPO and RTO times. And what this really means is that it's going to be sync commit between the different replicas that we're actually going to set up here in this. So from a database support perspective, we've got the number of the different databases that we've got in here. So once again, this is just more of a reference information for you. So what we've got here is that the majority of the databases are actually supported. The only one that's currently not supported is the Power Pivot, and that's essentially because it hasn't been tested yet. Now, hopefully we'll be getting a little bit more guidance around that out very shortly, because I do believe that the team's actually working on that. Now, the other one, though, is that we've got the usage. So although you can actually do sync commit on the usage database, it is actually not recommended. Now, the reason behind that is that the usage database tends to have a lot of I/O associated with that. So if we're doing that, it can potentially actually have a performance impact onto your farm if you're actually trying to replicate that across as well, or trying to do that. The other thing too is that it tends to be a little bit transient as well. So what I mean by that is that the usage is usually only around for a little bit of a time, and if it's not there, then sometimes it doesn't really matter. So generally as a guideline, what we tend to do as part of that, or at least in the designs that I've been doing, is that I don't usually put the usage into availability group. We keep it separate, just to try and get better performance on the farm. So what I'm going to do now is actually jump into a demo and actually start trying to wire up some of these. So I kind of briefed through some of the concepts, but I'll try and explain a little bit more about how this actually works. So what I'm going to do on this demo is I've effectively got the start position. So what I've got is that I've got a farm, and for this particular demo, it's actually going to be farm 8. Now, the reason behind that is that I've got in my lab or demo environment, I've got a number of different farms. So I happen to be using farm number 8 with this, so I'm just trying to relate that back to this diagram. So you could think of about this as being farm 1, but in my particular demo, it's going to be farm 8. I've also got a number of different SQL Server database servers running in there. So I've got SQL 4, which you could regard as being SQL 1, and I've got another database server there called SQL 5, and once again, you can think of that as SQL 2. So that's our kind of default configuration. I've got farm 8 basically using SQL 4, and everything being written there and using that as a database perspective. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this configuration such that the farm's going to use a cluster resource, and it can then either point to SQL Server 4, SQL Server 5, using this failover cluster, etc., associated with that, so I can actually go through and failover on that. So what I'm going to do is jump into my demo environment, and hopefully just give this a few seconds, because sometimes due to the network latency, this can take a little bit of time to actually load. So what I've got as part of my farm configuration, if I kind of jump into it and look at my SQL Server 4 box I've got running in here. Now, one of the first things I need to do is go through and configure this as being part of a cluster. So if I look at the nodes that I've got under here, I've already gone through and I've currently actually added in the nodes into here. So I've already gone through and configured the cluster that I've got associated with this. The other thing that I've done is I've also gone in here, I'm just going to zoom in here if I can, and I've also gone through and created a file share witness, etc. on here. So basically I'm allowing for the situation where whether or not it needs to be able to vote as part of the quorum, so I don't get into what we call a split brain type scenario. So just using the file share witness, etc. in there. So I've already gone through and configured this up, so I've got clustering running in there. So that's pretty good from a server perspective, but then what do I need to do from a SQL perspective? So what I then do is that I go into my SQL Server instances. If I then go and look at my instances that are running, look at the properties. So this is new to SQL Server 2012, is that I've got this new tab in here, which provides the ability here to say, right, I can now actually go in here and I've got this always on availability tag. So once I've gone through and actually created the cluster, which I've already gone through and created in here, I can then say whether or not I want to actually add this into the availability group. Now this is a completely different approach from what you used to have to do with if we're going to set up SQL clustering. You would actually have to install SQL as part of the installation and join it into the cluster that way. So this is a completely different approach that we need to do here. So all I've already gone through and done is gone through, enabled it, joined it into the cluster. I've then started and stopped the SQL Server instance that I've got running in here. Basically the service, stopped and started that. And then when I go into SQL Server Manager, I can then see what I can then have this option, and I can then start adding databases and create my availability groups. So what I'm going to do is just go through and kick off the wizard that we've got associated here. So the first thing I do here is go through and give it an actual name for my availability group. So I'm going to call this SP Content 2. I'm using 2 because I've done this a number of times. I just want to make sure that I don't get any clashes anywhere else. I then go through and then I can then select the databases. So what I've got in part of these databases that I've got here, I've got different things that basically say what's the actual status, etc. that I've required on this. So in order to put something into an availability group, one of the requirements is that a full backup needs to have actually been recently done. The other thing that it requires is that it needs to be in full recovery mode as well. So this is kind of standard as to how we'd set up something like log shipping or SQL mirroring, is that we still need to go through and actually set this type of stuff up. So what I've got here is that I've got this content database here, which is the Webcast one. I've already gone through and I've already done a database backup of that. So I'm going to select on that to take that one through. I then specify the replicas. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically say that I'm going to do automatic failover of this, and I'm going to do synchronous commit up to 3, which basically means I can actually take it across to 2. So at the moment I've only got one node in here. So what I need to do here is add in another replica. So I'm going to connect through to one of the other database servers. I'm going to add in number 5, which is what I want to do my replication to. And I want to provide the ability here to basically do automatic failover up to 2 and have synchronous commit up to 3, etc. on there. If I look at some of the other tags that I've got in here, we've got the endpoints. So this is basically where these ports come into it, okay? So it's effectively using this protocol to come through to it. It's specifying the default port of being 5022 in order to do it. The other thing I can do, if I look at my backup preferences, and this is where I can go through and say, what type of backup, which one do I want to use for actually doing the backups from. I then go through and look at my listeners, and this is where I can go through and configure the listener. Now, I will do this as part of setting this up. So I'm going to create an availability group listener, and I'm going to call this SP Content, I'm just going to call that Content 2. I'm going to use a port that I know that it's going to use, 1433, and I'm going to then add in the IP address associated with this because I'm going to use a static. Now, just one thing to note, I've actually got a couple of different network adapters associated with this particular virtual machine. One trick to be wary of, one thing to watch out for is make sure that you do actually choose the right network adapter. I'm then going to give it an IP address. Oops, 10.240 should work. Go OK. Click on Next. OK. Then what happens here is that I need to specify the common shared background where all the nodes can actually access. So this is being used by all the nodes or the replicas that I'm specifying to actually start seeding the initial, the database that I've actually got here. So this is that common location that I need to actually be aware of in order to set this up. I go through and do on the next, and this is going to go through and actually do some validation and checks to make sure that everything's actually up and running. So that's all pretty good. We then go through, click on next, and then we can actually grab the script out of this. So that's another thing I should actually point out. Although I'm actually showing this with Wizard, you can actually go through and script this if you wanted to as well. So I'm just going to click on finish and basically let this go through. So what this is doing is going through behind the scenes and actually going through and creating up the availability group, basically grabbing the databases, doing the backups, taking that across, seeding it into the other database server, etc. for me. It's also looking at some other bits and pieces. It's looking at creating the availability group listener and essentially just going through and creating this. Now, if you haven't got port 5022 being open, then creating the listener is something that you usually fail. So there's something you basically need to check to make sure that you've actually got up and going. So that's basically gone through and created everything in here. So if I look at under here, I can see what my replicas are, what the databases are in here, and also what is my actual particular listener that I've used in here. Now the interesting thing is about this particular listener is that this has actually gone through and created something in DNS for me as well. So if I look at my DNS server, so if I'm just going to jump across, what this should have done, if I refresh, it should have, if I look at SP content 2, what it's done under here is it's gone through and created a DNS record for me in here. So this is another thing you need to be aware of as well. If you're going to be creating these availability groups, the account or the user that's using or that creating this does actually need to have rights back in to creating the DNS entries, or at least the permissions in order to do that. So what we've got here is that this is our IP address. So this basically becomes the reference and the pointer to what's actually, that we're going to use to access it. So that's all pretty good. So that looks, fine, dandy. We've got our database server, now in here. It's part of the availability group. However, from a SharePoint perspective, we've still got a number of issues associated with that. One of them is that if we look at our particular SharePoint farm, where we've got our standard site here, which is still fully operational, this still works, etc., it doesn't actually know about that is part of the availability group. So hence what we need to do is actually go through and change the connection strings associated with this such that we can actually go through and actually point to the listener so we can actually have, so we can actually fail over and start using this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a SQL Server alias to get to there. So this is just standard stuff. So I'm going to call this SPBCM1, make sure that it's TCP, and I'm going to point it to the listener, SP content 2, get rid of the dynamic port. So basically what I'm doing here is that I'm creating a SQL Server alias called SPBCM1, make sure I get the spelling right, and then I'm going to point through to that listener that I've got in there. So I'll go OK. So now I need to actually go through and change my content database to actually use that. So what can do is that I can actually do a couple of different approaches on there. I'm just going to zoom that in a little bit. I could go through and do a dismount and remount, which is one way of changing the connection strings, but that's quite a brutal way of doing it. So what I'm going to do is probably make it a little bit more safer, is go through and I'm going to get the connection strings out of here. So if I look at that, I can see that my connection string is actually, down under here, still pointing to SQL 4. I'm going to change that to be SPBCM1. Change that, commit the change, and if I go back under here now, get that, what I should be able to see here is that I'm now actually pointing through to BCM1. So at this point now is that if I do fail over, SharePoint now knows about it, it's pointing to the listener and I should be away laughing. However, there's still another issue I need to worry about. I need to go back into my my new node that I've created in my other database instance, if I look at the databases that are in here, if I look it up in here, we can see we've been synchronized. Okay, so we're all good from that perspective. However, what we've got, or one of the issues that we've got, is that we haven't got any of our login accounts actually being pulled through on here. So this is one of the things we need to worry about when you're initially setting this up. So what I need to do is actually add in the account that I'm using here, or sorry, the application pool service account that I'm using in here. So I happen to know that that's going to be SPF 8 web app. Okay, and I need to just add that into there. Now it's already part of the security. Oh, sorry, I can't actually go into that one. That's fine. If I go back into here, if I look at the server roles, sorry, user mapping, okay, it will actually go through and make sure that it's actually been mapped through okay. So at this particular point in time, I've actually set up everything. If I go back to my SQL Server 4, if I go back and look at my cluster, I go back into the roles, what I'll see is that I've got under here is that I've actually got my listener, which is a cluster resource, and that's all working. If I go back to my farm, make sure that my content database is actually, sorry, that my site's still working, because we've gone through and changed the connection string. So that's all good. I can now go into SQL. I can now go through, go into here. I can then do a manual failover of this, go next. Make sure that we're doing no data loss, and I'm just going to fail over, do a connect through to that one, go next, and I'm going to finish. So that should basically go through and fail over to the other SQL Server node that I've got running in here, and that should finish in a couple of seconds. Okay, go close, and if we go back under here, our site's actually still working, and we've actually failed over, and we're still completely operational. So that's pretty straightforward and very, very easy to do. So kind of summarize again, what I ended up doing was going through, creating the clustered resource, which was the listener, change the connection strings in order to use that. So already created the cluster, always did the AlwaysOn and SQL Server. Didn't check the firewall rules, but basically I knew that was already done. I've already backed up the content databases, added the second replica, created the listener, configured the SQL Server permissions, changed the connection strings, and then actually did a failover there to make sure that that worked. So if we then look at it from a disaster recovery perspective, so the thing about disaster recovery is that this is actually a very, very complex type of thing to worry about. And it really takes a lot of looking at what type of service applications that you've got, what are the associated databases that you've got there. Also, what else are you actually using in a particular farm? For example, if you're using Workflow Manager and you've got a Workflow Manager farm, then you need to look at how you're actually going to do that disaster recovery of those and actually bring those in. What this means is that if you're doing it from a disaster recovery perspective, you're effectively going to be doing asynchronous commit between the different replicas. So what we need to think about there is how we're going to do our failover processes from both a planned and from an unplanned perspective. So we need to be able to, if we hit a disaster, we need to know exactly how we're going to do this. So one of the things we can do, and this is a little bit of a tip, which is we can actually look at our database synchronicity, and we can actually look at how up-to-date are our actual replicas. And this can actually, by simply running a script like this, we can go through and actually look at how up-to-date are our actual replicas that we've got, and whether or not we actually do need to go into a DR situation, or how far behind and how we actually met the RPOs that we're trying to actually adhere to. So some other considerations too. So I'm just going to briefly touch on that. The search service application is still a difficult thing from a SharePoint 2013 perspective with regards to doing disaster recovery. Now, the reason behind that is that some of the settings are not all stored in the content database. For example, if you look at some of the search schema changes that we do, they're actually stored back in the search databases. So if you're trying to take your search across, the only real way of actually doing this is actually to take a search service application backup and restore. which will basically do a full fidelity capture of all the data, the settings, and etc., and do a restore across that into the other farm. Now, I do know Neil's actually working on a white paper, etc., associated with this, so we're going to be getting out some more guidance around how do we actually do disaster recovery from a stitch service application going forward. So, other considerations, things to be aware of is if you've got any customizations in your farm. So obviously, if you're doing full trust solutions, you need to deploy them both to both farms. It kind of goes without saying. However, the one thing you do need to think about is what are those customizations doing? So if you get something that is modifying something out of the content DB, such as modifying the web.config, etc., then you need to think about how those features are actually scoped and how do you actually apply them. So effectively what this means from a development perspective is that your developers may need to re-architect or redesign or refactor their solutions. So the key thing here is that you deploy both solutions to both farms. You deploy your solutions to both farms, but you then have to activate the SP farm and SP web application scope features in the secondary farm. If you're doing any configuration changes, obviously you need to replan the secondary if these are being persisted into the configuration DB. So this becomes part of this operational complexity of actually keeping two farms up and running and making sure that they're actually consistent in there. So what we're going to look at here is how do we do a warm standby and from an always-on availability group perspective. So looking at the demo environment that I've got here, so what we've got on the left is that we've got the farm 8. So we've already gone through here and configured this up, looked at the cluster resources, etc. that we've got there. We've already gone through and configured that up. I've then got farm 9, and this is going to act as our disaster recovery. So I'm kind of pretending that my farm 8 is in Seattle and my DR farm is based in New York. What it's going to look like is that we're going to join in SQL Server 6 into the same cluster, and then provide the ability to actually do a failover across into a DR farm, which is based elsewhere. So clicking into the demo environment, what I've already done though, just to kind of save on time, I've already added SQL Server 6 into the cluster, so that's already sitting in here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add, oh, sorry, I've already done a failover. That's fine. So I need to go in. I'll just refresh this in. I'm going to add in a new replica under here. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to connect through to that one. Go connect. Make sure we got there. I'm going to specify an additional replica. So I'm going to go under here and choose SQL Server 6 to bring that in. Reconnect, but this time what I'm going to do is that I'm not actually going to go through and specify that we're going to do automatic failover, or we're going to do asynchronous commit. And the other thing I'm going to do, which is probably something that we didn't actually allow, was change this to be a readable secondary. Now the reason behind that is that I want to be able to actually connect this database up into this particular farm. So it's kind of putting that as secondary so I can actually read this. So go through and do a next. Once again, shared by all locations. So once again, this needs to be my place that I had before. So SQL backups. Hopefully that's the right place. Oops, got a typo there. Go next, and it's going to go, oops, I got the location wrong. Cancel, one's going to cheat. So hopefully I can see that. Yes, SQL backup. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Get rid of that. That should be okay. Okay, go through and hit next, and we've basically gone through. So the other thing I should have pointed out that I've already done in this particular farm is that I've already gone through, created a web application in here, and with the same name or the same URL that I actually had before, but I also had seeded it with a dummy database as well, just so I can actually go through and create it and get that going. So what I've done is I've created this availability group. If I go back into, going back into here, that's gone closed. I've now got, if I look at my databases, etc., it's still going to be in there, so we're all good from that perspective. If I look at SQL Server 6, going through into here, if I refresh the databases that I've got in here, I've now got this webcast that I've just started synchronizing coming through. So now what I've got to do is go back into my farm, and what I've got to do is actually just mount that database back into here so I can actually join that into it. So I'm just going to do that and mount that in. So that's going to join that database into here, and that's gone through and actually worked okay. So the other thing I need to worry about though is once again is that I need to go back and make sure that my permissions, etc., are in here. So once again, the logons, although I've got that coming through on there, I actually need to specify that my web ad account has actually got, from a user mapping perspective, they've actually got access to that content DB. So I need to go through and give that SP data access to that. Otherwise, if I do fail over, as part of that, my web service account, web application service account won't actually have access to that database. So, oops, I've got that read-only. This is something I need to go back and set up once I've actually done the failover. So let's go over and do a failover. So into here, and I'm going to do my failover. Go next. Okay, and select new primary, go asynchronous commit. It's going to give me a warning that because I'm doing asynchronous, there could potentially be data loss associated with this. I'm going to go, that's fine, go connect through, go next, and I'm then going to go through, and that should actually fail it over. Now, the other thing I should point out too about the farm is that my connection string back on in my farm 9 is actually pointing directly to the SQL Server and not to the listener. Now, the reason behind that is that I don't want to get the potential of actually having a stretch farm type configuration. So now if I go back, and I've mounted that already, if I go back into here, change the user mapping, add that back, and I can now do that, SP data access, that should now work. If I go to my DNS entry, go into here, I can then go back and change my IP address to point to my other farm, go OK. If I jump back to my farm, I can then flush the DNS, okay, make sure that I'm actually pointing to it. Now, one thing I do need to worry about though is that because I've done a failover, one of the issues that I've got there is that the site map is actually being maintained in the configuration DB. So if any new site collections have been added in, they're not going to appear in the actual failover. So what I'm going to do here is that I do need to go through and actually update the site map in the config DB in my failover farm as part of my failover processes. So once I've done that, if I then go back over to my farm, I go create a new tab, go back to the webcast, then this should actually go through and actually start working, etc. in here. So that should actually be all fine now, and I've actually done a failover as part of that. So just kind of summarizing on that, basically what I did was that I already created the farm with the temporary content database. I've added the server to the cluster, already did that, added in the asynchronous commit, did the attached replica, configured the permissions, did the failover, and updated the site map, etc. as part of that process. So we've had these database support statements that have been sitting out there in TechNet quite a long time. Now, fortunately, as part of, there was an announcement at the SharePoint conference, well, it wasn't too long ago, but whenever it was, basically there was an announcement which actually said we've actually changed the supportability statements of these. So they've been sitting in there since pretty much day 0 around what we actually do from a synchronous replication perspective. So if we look at these now, we've actually finally got the ability to do asynchronous commit or supportability statements on these databases. Power Pivot is still not haven't been tested, but hopefully we'll get some guidance out there. So if we look at the databases that we've got, we can now do synchronous replication. It's pretty much all of them apart from state servers, which makes sense. UPA sync, we can't, which also makes sense. And although you can do usage, once again, it's something that we don't recommend you can actually do. So what this means now is that you can actually go through and start using asynchronous commit, using an always on, using these supportability statements. Now there is a bit of a caveat around here. This has only been tested with the April 2014 CU, which hasn't actually been released yet. So although in theory this should actually work with previous versions, like with SP1 or even back to the RTM bits, it hasn't been tested. So generally the guidance that we're giving out there is that you should really be on the April CU when this comes out in order to actually have a supportable environment on here. So there's also some new stuff which has actually been happening as part of the April CU. So we've actually done some really good work with regards to actually making always on a deeper and more richer part of SharePoint. So we've got these new PowerShell commands which are part of the April CU, and that's the ability to add a database to the availability group, remove databases from the availability group, as well as having a look at the get the availability group status. So this is a really rich, deep integration with it, which is available in the April CU bits. Now, fortunately, I've actually got a copy of, a preliminary copy of the April CU bits, which are currently running in this particular demo environment. What I'm going to do is flick back and see if I can actually get this going for you. However, I did actually notice something when I was running through on this, is that I do need to actually, because I've got this, I need to actually fail back to my original just to get this showing, because I didn't actually set this up properly. So I'm just going to fail it back to SQL 4, get this back going. If I then go into my Farm 8, and if I look at my availability groups, what I can do here is I can actually get my availability group status. So I'm just going to clear the window so you can see this. If I run this, I can actually see what the availability groups are actually running in here. So I can actually see this. Now there is a little bit of a gotcha, which is part of a little bit of a demo, because I've run through this a number of times. If you haven't already run this add availability group to it, SharePoint doesn't actually know about it. So what this means is that if I'd run this initially, I was actually expecting this to come back and being blank because I didn't know about it. What I would need to then do is actually add that database originally back into it. To kind of show that this actually works, what I can do is add another database into this, and this will take basically another database that I've got. It's going to add it into the availability group and basically get everything up and running in here for me. Now what this will do behind the scenes, kind of flicking across, if I look at my availability groups, do a refresh on here, look at my databases, I can see that's been added in. So this is part of that deep, rich integration stuff that I've got in here. The other thing that it does too, which is pretty cool, if I look at my replicas that I've got in here, it also manages some of the security logins. So it also adds in the FP Farm 8, so the farm account in here. Previously I only added in the web service application account. But now, because we've put it directly back in using this availability group, it also sets up the permissions behind the scenes as well for us on the Farm 8, but it still doesn't do the web application one. So if we look at back over here, that's been added in here, and we've now got that availability group being completely added into here. And once again, if we then do the get status on that, we can basically go and look at the details. So this is something which is new in the April CU, and there's a deep, richer integration, etc. with this. I mean, this is some really, really good stuff that we've been crying out for a while. So, just pretty conscious of time, got wrapped going a little bit over, so I do apologise for that. So just kind of a review, what we've done is looked at the concept of business continuity and how it impacts SharePoint, looked at the differences between high availability and disaster recovery, and hopefully just given you a bit of an understanding as to how you can configure SQL Server AlwaysOn for implementing HANDR, as well as showing you some of the new stuff that's coming out as part of the April CU. So with that,